Do you remember how your lockdown journey began? Do you remember those last 2 Sundays that we had in our church building? The second last one, we had a meal together after the morning service. We were a little unsure whether to go ahead with it because of the crisis that we knew was on its way. But we went ahead, and there was something very special about having that meal together. And that very last Sunday that we had together before we closed, on the 15th of March, that morning we celebrated with another meal. We celebrated with the bread and the wine that Jesus commanded churches to eat and drink together in order to remember his death. How special was that our very last day together as church was celebrated with the communion meal. Since then, we've been on a bit of a journey, haven't we? We've tried to figure out how to be something of what it means to be church, but doing that online. We've had to get used to singing in our living rooms. We've had to make more of an effort to ring each other regularly and to stay in contact in other ways rather than just bumping into each other on a Sunday. We've learnt what it is to mute and unmute ourselves in order to pray on Zoom. Dare I say that some of us are still actually learning that one. And now, as restrictions are significantly easing, we're figuring out how to make the most of that, meeting each other outdoors in the open air, having people round to our gardens, and hopefully next month we'll be able to open up our building again as the journey comes full circle. What about your own lockdown journey? What have you been through? Maybe you've learnt a new skill or read a book that you've been putting off or taken up a hobby. Maybe you found it hard coping with isolation, or maybe there's not been enough isolation because the kids have been at home all the time. Your journey may have involved sickness or sadness. Well, our journey is not over. We don't know how long it will be before there is some semblance of normality. Well, for Israel, God's people in the time before Jesus, they were on a journey. In this passage that we've had read in Numbers chapter 9, we see Israel going on a journey. And they're going on a journey throughout the whole book. We're going to dip our toes into this book and journey along with them just through 3 significant moments. We're going to look at the cloud, the snake, and the rock. Well, their journey would take them from the land of Egypt, where they were slaves, to the land that was promised to them, Canaan. It echoes the life of the Christian, the journey of faith. And the starting point for both the Christian and the people of Israel is exactly the same. The journey begins with redemption. You may have seen the word redeem at the bottom of a voucher. It may say something like you can redeem this voucher at a particular shop, restaurant or website or something like that. To redeem something is to exchange something for something else. So in the restaurant you exchange the voucher for a discounted meal. It was often used in slavery terms as well. So a slave could be redeemed or purchased by another person, or even a slave could redeem themselves in order to set themselves free. And in that, the word redeem can also mean to set free or to liberate. For Israel, this was clearly true for them. They had been oppressed. They were in forced labour. They probably were forced to build some of the ancient Egyptian sites that still exist today. They couldn't just do as they pleased. They were owned as a whole people group by the ancient Egyptians. But God redeemed them. He set them free. After he gave Pharaoh the chance to set them free for himself, and after Pharaoh refused 9 times, God forced Pharaoh's hand in a final plague where the firstborn of each family died. But God's people were kept safe. They killed a lamb and spread its blood on the doorpost of their house, and that kept them safe. It sounds gruesome, doesn't it? But it shows just how costly our freedom is, particularly the deeper freedom that we'll see in a minute. So that lamb that was killed, it was also eaten, and that meal that they had, eating the lamb, it was called the Passover Meal. In the reading just before the one that we've had, there is a passage there talking about how the Israelites were supposed to celebrate the Passover meal, how they were to remember time and time again this freedom that God had brought about for them in the death of the Lamb. So the Israelite journey began with redemption, with freedom from slavery. And the same is true for the Christian and for their journey of faith. There is no journey, there is no Christian life until the person has been set free or redeemed. But that's not from physical slavery. It's from the slavery that is our sin. Sins are the things that we do that are wrong, and it's also an attitude of rejection of God. And the more that we sin, the more that we're bound by that sin. We can't set ourselves free. We can't fix the wrong that we've done. We can't loose ourselves from that attitude of rejection of God. Jesus himself said that anyone who sins is a slave to sin. But in the very next breath, almost, he says, if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. If Jesus sets us free, we are truly free. He forgives our past failures. He releases us from the powerful grip of our rejection of God. And this by dying as a human Passover lamb, shedding his blood for us. If we accept that Jesus has done this for us, if we entrust our lives to him, then he has set us free. Free from sin and free from the ultimate consequences of sin. If you've not experienced that for yourself, then that's what Jesus offers primarily. Redemption from sin. That then is how the journey for the Christian begins. Redemption. But back with Israel and our story with them. They'd just set up the tabernacle. And that was a place for worshipping and meeting with God. But it was a tent. The rest of the people also lived in tents at this time, because if you're going on a very long journey, you need to live in something that is portable, like a tent. On the very day that they set up this tent, a cloud covered it. This cloud was the presence of God. It had been with them beforehand, and it was God showing himself that he was right there with his people. The cloud looked like fire at night so that they could visibly see that God was still present with them, even in the dark. But here's what goes on in our passage. Every time that the cloud lifted up from the tabernacle and moved somewhere, the people would pack up their camp and move on as well. Every single person would have to go to their tent, take it down, pack it up, carry it to wherever the cloud went and stopped. What's more, they would pack up this large tabernacle tent as well and take that with them also. As the detail tells us, sometimes the cloud would stay a very long time, which meant they could stay put for a long time, a month or even a year. But other times God's presence would only stay for a few days, or sometimes even for just one night, and they'd have to pack up and move on. Now, there were around 2.5 million people probably that had to do this. Imagine trying to coordinate 2.5 million people packing up their tents and moving on, especially as there are always people who are the last to leave, aren't there? You've got around 600,000 tents to pack up. You've got all of the cattle to herd, children to organise, and sometimes you're just doing that for one night. Sounds like a palaver to me. But they did it. This passage repeats again and again how God's people very simply obeyed God whenever his presence moved, or if his presence stayed, they stayed as well. Now, God's people, they didn't know the master plan. They didn't know the route. They didn't know what direction their next step would take them in. But they did know their final destination, and they did know who to follow. Now remember, for us, as we're talking about our context, if you're not on the journey of faith as a Christian, if you've not been set free by Jesus, then you cannot follow him. But if you are a Christian, you know your final destination, and you know who to follow. There are so many unknowns in life, aren't there? No one predicted the pandemic. We were all caught somewhat by surprise. We can't predict the exact course that our lives will take us in. We don't know what's around the corner. We don't know necessarily where we will be in 10 years' time. Even though we might have dreams and plans, they don't always happen, do they? But if you're a Christian, you know who you can follow. You know who will lead you through all of those uncertainties that you face. You can trust him to guide you each step of the way. And he guides us by his presence, his Holy Spirit, who is at the very centre of our lives, just as the tent and cloud were at the centre of the Israelite community. Now, that doesn't mean that God's Spirit tells us exactly what we should do in each and every scenario, far from it. But the Spirit has given us instructions on how we are to live the Christian life in the Bible, and he guides us by those words in the Bible. He also guides us by the wisdom that he supplies in order to make the decisions that we make in life, even when the Bible doesn't speak about a specific scenario. Now, that doesn't mean we'll get every decision absolutely right in our lives every time and never make mistakes. But we can trust that even through the mistakes and missteps, he will lead us to our ultimate destination, which is to be in the promised land of the new creation. We can trust him to lead us because he has redeemed us. Because Jesus has set us free, we can know that he will lead us through this life, keeping us secure and taking us to be with him forever when he returns to this world. Let me finish with a story. I read this on a blog by someone called Seth Lewis just this last week. And maybe this will help reinforce everything that we've been talking about so far. These are Seth's words. I grew up beside a mountain in Alabama with a dog. If you want a happy childhood, that's a good start. Sometimes the dog and I would go up the mountain, just us, with no particular destination in mind. There was always something interesting up there, little run-off streams and rock outcrops, sunlight through leaves, and the awareness of being among innumerable living things. We stayed together, but not too close. The dog and I were interested in different things, probably because I couldn't smell as well as she could. Still, we stayed within sight, and if I decided to explore in a different direction, all I had to say was, "Cinnamon, I'm going this way," and she would change course without complaining. I guess there were smells to discover anywhere we went. Eventually I'd decide it was a good time to head home. I did try my best to track our adventures on a mental map so I could find the way back, but I wasn't very good at it. The trees up there look a lot like each other, in fairness. I learned quickly that there was a much better solution. "Cinnamon, it's time to go home now. Let's go home, girl." And off she'd go, in the opposite direction from where I thought the house was. But she was always right. With her nose constantly to the ground, she knew better than the boy with the complex brain who was looking around and trying. She was flawless. All I had to do was keep up. I had to follow her against my own intuitions, but I knew her judgment was better than the best of mine. I knew that trusting myself to find the way home was the best way to get myself even more lost. I knew that I had everything I needed with me. It just wasn't in me. All I had to do to find the path home was let go of my own ideas, trust the dog, and follow. And if I can trust a dog that way, why is it so hard for me to trust that the God who made me knows the path to life better than I do? Well, I think there's only one song we can sing now in response to that, particularly as a church that is based in Wales. So let's sing together. "Guide me, O thou great Jehovah."